Did David Stearns build this Mets roster to sell at the deadline?
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All you amazing Mets fans, you're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Were the New York Mets built to sell this year? Was there always a thought in the back of David Stearns' mind and everyone else in the Mets front office that they were constructing a roster that could be torn down at the deadline to continue to build up this farm system? It is a very nuanced discussion, and that's why I'm excited to talk about it. Mets got rained out, so this was the perfect opportunity to talk about the process the Mets went through this offseason and why it has them in line to be one of the most aggressive and best sellers to once again take advantage of the deadline to improve this farm system. So let's talk about the strategy, the plan. And first, let's get in the mind of the executive that is running the New York Mets. David Stearns comes from Milwaukee, where he has spent a lot of seasons keeping that team relevant. How did he do it? Good drafting, good developing, creative trades, and the right signing here or there, but never being able to use free agency to build out that type of a team that could just sign a couple guys and take off. That was never the MO in Milwaukee. It's a small market team. So with that backdrop, with the experience that he had in the past, bringing that to New York in this situation, I don't believe that David Stearns went into this offseason squarely focused on the deadline. He's talked about getting comfortable in an organization. It takes one full baseball cycle to get there. And I don't think that you skip to the middle of that cycle as you're making your decisions in October, November, December, January, February. Like, I think it is a step-by-step meticulous process. And the first part of that is building a competitive team, but understanding your window. And that's what I think the Mets did this offseason. Max Scherzer had his comments, right, about the Mets window after they traded him last year. He waived the no-trade clause because he got the understanding from the Mets brass that it was about contending in 25 and 26. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were just flatly and bluntly punting 2024. It means that they were not going to go full bore aggressive into winning this year, which means you don't trade for Juan Soto in the offseason, right? Like, if the Mets were still gung-ho to win it all, they would have cashed in the assets they got at last year's trade deadline, packaged up Luis Angel Acuna, and actually, I don't know if the Padres would even want that package. They wanted pitching, but regardless, they would have done what they could to get Juan Soto, plug him in for a one-year run, and you hope you sign him the next year. That would have been the all-in, still trying to win Mets. But that would have been really stupid in retrospect. And trust me, I own the fact that I did some Juan Soto trade podcasts this offseason. I'll wear it like a badge of honor. I did it. But now, armed with hindsight, you see how stupid that would have been, right? What the Mets saw was a roster that still had some good pieces, and they had a great need for pitching. And if their lineup was going to be good, it was going to have to come from the core players in place. Now, you look at the guys that were signed this offseason, and you go for the players that had multi-year deals, right? 5 years or more, you're Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Nola, Jung-Hoo Lee, and Josh Hader. Aaron Nola was never leaving Philly. Yoshinobu Yamamoto, we learned, was never going anywhere but LA, where he was going to join up with Shohei Ohtani. Jung-Hoo Lee ends up getting overpaid, in my opinion, to the Giants. He looked good early this season, but that was still a big contract for an unproven commodity. And then Josh Hader, the Mets have Edwin Diaz. They were never going to do that. You go to 4-year deals. You had Eduardo Rodriguez, Shota Imanaga, Jordan Hicks, Wandy Peralta. The Mets tried to sign Wandy Peralta, but they never going to give him 4 years. Eduardo Rodriguez went to Arizona, where he joined forces with a couple of guys that he worked with in Boston in Mike Hazen and Torey Lovello, the GM and the manager. So it made sense why he signed there. Shota Imanaga, I was campaigning this offseason for the Mets to sign him, and man, he would have been a perfect fit. But he ends up in Chicago. Seems like he really wanted to be there and probably to be a star of that team, whereas maybe he didn't think he could have done that with the Mets with Kodai Senga in place. Then you have Jordan Hicks, which the Giants hit the lottery on to convert him to be a starting pitcher with what he's done so far this year. But it's not like there was 30 teams that were in on that idea. So you can't really fault the Mets there. Look at the 3-year deals that are given out. Cody Bellinger, Sonny Gray, Matt Chapman, Jeimer Candelario, Seth Lugo, Lourdes Gurriel, Jorge Soler, Robert Stevenson. None of those players was going to change the landscape for the New York Mets. And there's a series of 2-year deals that were given out, and there was pretty much the same story there. Sean Manaea, one of those deals. There was only 19 contracts given out throughout the entire offseason that were of more than 1 year. Okay, so there wasn't a lot of teams that were spending for multi-year deals. There wasn't a lot that could have improved the Mets drastically in free agency. So the best bet that they had was rounding out their pitching staff with 1-year deals and seeing if that got them to contention. So they find Luis Severino, and they think that's a good bounce back candidate. They end up signing Sean Manaea to a 2-year deal that has a player option on it, and that's because he had a better market than a Severino. And then they made their additions in the bullpen between re-signing Adam Ottavino to Jake Diekman, Jorge Lopez, Shintaro Fujinami, a bunch of minor league signings. And they did the best they could to put together a competitive team. They signed Harrison Bader. They traded for Adrian Hauser and Tyrone Taylor. It was all these moves to try to raise the floor. But there was a byproduct to that if the Mets had to sell, they did have some pieces that could potentially play really well and turn themselves into assets. So I think when the Mets went through their process, was it a team that was strictly built to sell? No. But is it a team that was built well to sell? Absolutely. And I think that's just part of having a good process and knowing where you're at as a franchise. The Mets were in a position with a great free agent class to sign pieces that could have been part of a long-term core. They might have done that. But with a lot of dead money on the books and a very uncertain outlook on the season coming off a really bad year, they rounded out their roster and they did what they could, but they didn't get fully committed on more guys that could hold them back in future years. And that's just good business. And I think the one signing that was in some ways a built to sell signing was JD Martinez. Although that one also is a little bit too full because you can understand the idea of JD Martinez being a bat that pushes you a lot closer to contending. But you also have to remember that it took until the very bitter end of spring training to sign that guy. Why was that? Well, part of the initiative of this year was seeing what you had in the young players. And I think there was probably a good amount of voices in that front office that made it clear that the Mets should see what they have in Mark Vientos. And that's why there was probably a real internal struggle on if it made sense to make that one signing. Now, as I talked about in the offseason, JD Martinez was a free agent that could fall into the Mets last because there was not a lot of teams that were interested. You probably had Mets and Angels as the final two, and he preferred to go to the Mets to play in that market, to not be in the second fiddle LA team after being on the Dodgers the year before, a better chance to contend, maybe a better city to live in, whatever it is. But he wanted the Mets, and you got him on a team-friendly deal. That contract, though, is very, very movable at the deadline. So again, it falls right back into that notion. Not necessarily built with the sole purpose of selling, but built well to be able to sell. A couple of years ago in 2022, David Stearns made the very polarizing decision to trade Josh Hader from the Brewers at a time when they were in the thick of a playoff race and they were absolutely a contender. And he weighed the calculus of it, decided that the value that they would get by dealing Hader at that time for the franchise was more worth it than keeping their closer in place for a run. And he said that he learned a lot from that because he underestimated how much ripping the closer out of that clubhouse meant to that team and how much that deflated a team that had a chance to make a run. And I think he's even said he's regretted that trade. But as you look at it from a Brewers perspective over the long haul and what ended up falling out from that, the Brewers turned Josh Hader into a package that included Estuary Ruiz, and Estuary Ruiz became William Contreras. And William Contreras is now arguably the best catcher in baseball, at least one of the best 2 or 3. And so you got 5 years of control, if I'm not mistaken, of William Contreras through, a series of moves for a year and a half of Josh Hader. That's a brilliant transaction in retrospect. One that I'm actually having our writing staff at Just Baseball whip up here in the coming weeks. It's a really good trade retrospective. That's what you have to think about when it comes to who David Stearns is as an executive. It's about being opportunistic with what the market presents to you. So this year, if a seller's market presents itself and the Mets have pieces that will get you 125 to 150 cents on the dollar, he's going to take that opportunity. And that's what I want to talk about next. The team that was built well to sell, what does that look like? Even if the Mets are somewhat close to the wild card race, are they going to be more inclined to sell, understanding where they're at as a franchise? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. First, though, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Stitch Fix. With Stitch Fix, you get a stylist who understands your style and budget, and they do all the shopping for you. It is the easiest way to update your wardrobe this season. I'll tell you, I am not a fan of going to the stores and trying on clothes, getting in the fitting room, all that stuff. And I'm not even necessarily a fan of going on, online retailers and shopping for things and having to try to pick what's my style. I don't know what I like. I'm not a fashionable guy. So Stitch Fix made the process so easy for me. I told them my size, my style, my budget preference, and then they started to show me some clothing options. I thumbs up the things that I liked, thumbs down the things I didn't, and they curated a list of clothes that fit my style. And they sent me 5 just for me pieces plus outfit recommendations and pro styling advice. And I was able to keep what I liked and send back what I didn't. Stitch Fix makes it all so easy. I got outfits now that make me look and feel really good. And it's just hassle-free. Shipping, returns, and exchanges are always free. It's style that makes you feel as good as you look. And you can get started today at stitchfix.com/MLB. You'll get $20 off your first fix. That's stitchfix.com/MLB for $20 off. Stitchfix.com/MLB. Must redeem within 7 days of sign up. If you're an everyday listener of the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you can ask me questions anytime. We can communicate back and forth. You also get my updates anytime something breaks on the Mets. You get the lineup graphics sent to your phone each day. So you get the starting 9 right there without having to go on social media. You can take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways as well. If you want to be one of our Locked On Mets insiders, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. And yesterday, I put out a poll following up the show that I did for Monday. Will the Mets see 500 again this year? And I asked the audience that on YouTube. What do you think the results were? I was actually impressed with the optimism that still exists from this fan base. And I think if I had asked that poll a day earlier, coming off of another brutal Mets loss, the results might have been different, but still, I was actually shocked that 40% of the audience believes the Mets will get back to 500 this year. 60% said nope. And I thought it was going to be closer to 75, 80, 20. I thought it was going to be more overwhelming. When you look at where this team's at, yes, they are still in this race. And if they put together 6 great weeks of baseball, or I guess it's probably a little more than that at this point, 8 good weeks of baseball ahead of the deadline, and they are squarely in the wild card, they're holding a wild card spot, I don't think this team sells a thing, and I think they might even selectively buy. They're not going to trade a top 10 prospect necessarily to buy unless they're getting a piece with control. So let's just say you need a starting pitcher and Jesus Luzardo's on the market and you still have control beyond this season, 2 years of it. Then I could see the Mets making a move, right? I could see them pushing some chips forward. If they needed or if they decided they wanted an outfielder and they could find an outfielder on the market that has some control, like Lane Thomas or something like that, whatever it is. If there's control attached, I could see them pushing some real chips forward. Otherwise, I think they're pretty much a sit on their hands team if they are in a wild card position. But let's just say that they get back to 500, like 40% of the audience believes. But that's it. They're sitting at 500 at the deadline. They're 4 games out of the wild card spot. Would the Mets sell? I think if you think about who David Stearns is and the trade he made with Josh Hader, I believe the Mets would sell the pieces that are going to get a big return. Are they going to sell the Mark Canha for Justin Jarvis type piece from last year? All due respect to Justin Jarvis. Was it Justin Jarvis? Yeah, he was Justin. I always get confused between the Eduardo Escobar trade and the Mark Canha trade. Coleman Crow was the prospect they got for Eduardo Escobar, who ended up in Milwaukee. Justin Jarvis came from Milwaukee to the Mets. He's pitching in AAA, but he is not some top-tier prospect. He's starter depth and probably more swingman depth. Would they make that trade if they were 4 games out? So would they trade Jose Quintana for a 29th ranked prospect in a system? Maybe not. Would they trade the Tommy Pham type piece, right? So would you trade Harrison Bader if you got X 19-year-old or 18-year-old or 17-year-old? I think Jeremy Rodriguez was 17 probably. You get some prospect that's tearing up the Dominican Summer League. If they love the prospect, yes. If they're sort of unsure on it, then probably not. But the point is, the pieces that you got to look at this trade deadline for the Mets. It's Luis Severino, it's Sean Manaea, it's JD Martinez, and it's Pete Alonso. Those are the 4. Those are the guys that will sort of tell us where the Mets are, and those are the pieces that I think can bring big returns. Relief pitchers, they don't necessarily bring you much. Now, if the Mets are where they're at now, if they're 8 games under, if they're 10 games under at the deadline, then it's no holds bar. You just trade everything. Everything must go. You just, whatever you can get back, you send it all away, and you take any prospect capital you can. But again, we're playing out a scenario where they're 500 and they're still sort of in the race. Well, the Mets could trade Luis Severino for a big package. I mean, I've talked about this already. I think I talked about it after he started the game on Saturday. So it would have been Sunday's show where I spent a lot of time on Sevy as a trade piece. And in that podcast, I basically broke down how Luis Severino could be the best rental starting pitcher available based on who will be in this market. So if you can get a Luis Angel Acuna type prospect from a team, a top 100 guy, a top 5 prospect in a system, or even a top 10 prospect in a really good system, for a guy that is going to be out the door after this season, most likely, you probably do it. Now, granted, there is a caveat with Sevy. You could always offer him a qualifying offer. You could always keep him in-house. There are some other things you would consider. Sean Manaea, it's a player option next year. I think that's a guy that if there's a team that really wants him, you probably move him. Now, here's the thing. The Mets could deal Luis Severino and Sean Manaea, and Kodai Senga might just be coming off the IL at that point. So one of those spots might be filled by a better pitcher. You might still have Jose Butto sitting in AAA. Could you trade Severino and Manaea and replace them, by product with Kodai Senga and Jose Butto and be a very similar team that's sitting at 500 and could still make a run in the second half? That's where this team is built very well to sell. You also have Blade Tidwell and Brandon Sproat. Tidwell's up in AAA. Sproat is just clearly heading towards being the pitcher of the year in the Mets farm system. Had another great start tonight in Binghamton. 7 innings pitched, 4 hits allowed, 2 walks, only 1 earned run, 5 strikeouts, 93 pitches to get through 7. Second start in a row where he has gotten through 7 innings. Pretty spectacular stuff in his first full professional season here. So Brandon Sproat, he could be up in AAA, and he's a guy that could actually push the Mets. So you know what? We're thinking about the future. Let's get this guy some MLB run. He's good enough. And there's a very fun team in the second half that can happen, or after the deadline, that could come together that's more entertaining because you're going to see some prospects that I think fans are dying to see, like Acuna coming up, playing second base, playing center field, wherever you can find a spot for him. And it can be a nice close to the season. You never know. The Mets could make a surprising run. Maybe not to actually getting to a wild card spot, but they could be sitting in September after having sold some pieces where they're 5 games out, but kind of at 500 a little bit better, and you're still tuning in and excited to watch games. That's really what I'm hoping for in a lot of respects, is that the Mets get some value that's going to turn into a better team in 2025 and beyond. But they're not abysmal. I'm not watching Jonathan Arauz play third base every day for the Mets or second base. Where did he play last year? Who cares? Now, the other pieces from that 4 I talked about. JD Martinez. Selling JD Martinez could be just as much about opening up a spot for Mark Vientos to play than anything else. Being able to roster and play Vientos and Beatty in the lineup every day for the final 2 months of the season. Now, you also could get a nice piece because JD Martinez is a good hitter. And while there weren't as many teams lining up for his services in the offseason, injuries open things up. And all of a sudden, you might find a team that is ready to bite. Now, there's Pete Alonso, which is a whole conversation that we're going to have a lot probably before the deadline. And there's so much when it comes to the attachment that Mets fans have with Pete Alonso. I'm wearing an LFGM shirt right now, right? The phrase that Pete Alonso coined. So we'll table that one. When it comes to the other pieces that could be sold, like Harrison Bader, if there's a team that wants Harrison Bader, you get something good for him, yeah, you do it. And that opens up playing time for Tyrone Taylor, who's going to be on your team next year, probably. For Acuna, potentially, you can put him in center field. For maybe Drew Gilbert, if he gets healthy and he starts to hit well in AAA when he finally does see the field, or even Jet Williams, same thing. If when he's healthy, he starts to play well, it could open up time for these guys. One last component when it comes to the selling conversation before we get back to real baseball, the doubleheader played on Tuesday, and maybe table this trade talk for a little bit. That's Starling Marte and Jeff McNeil. Here's where I will be very curious about how aggressive the Mets are to sell those two guys, because they would have to eat a lot of money. I don't think you can trade Jeff McNeil. He's owed $33.5 million beyond this season. He's making $10.25 this year, $15.75 million in the next 2 years, and then a $2 million buyout on another club option at $15.75 million. The Mets would have to eat a lot of money to deal him, and he'd have to rake over the next 2 months for a team to be interested in Jeff McNeil. So I don't think that that's going to happen just based on the money that's owed. I think Jeff McNeil, for whatever it's worth, is probably more valuable to the Mets than any other team in baseball. Now, Starling Marte is a little more interesting. $19.5 million. I actually tweeted this out tonight because of, for those of you who don't know, Ronald Acuna Jr. tore his other ACL. He's out for the season. And I said past midnight thought, if Starling Marte got traded to the Braves, how quickly would he become a 300 hitter again? I see him being Marcelo Ozuna, but somehow playing good defense in the outfield again. We'll talk about his defense in a minute here too. But Marte's a guy where the Mets could eat money down if he's playing well, potentially clear him off the roster so he's not your problem. Yes, it'd be dead money, but it might open up some things for the prospects you have coming. So that's just another thing to put on the back burner. Ultimately, the New York Mets have a window here with the players that are in place to prove that they can actually contend this season. Will they do that? I believe it's doubtful. 60% of the audience believes it's doubtful. 40% still has optimism, and we'll see how it plays out. But if the Mets are not convincingly wildcard contenders, if they are not holding on to a wildcard spot, I imagine in some capacity, they're going to take advantage of what will likely be a seller's market, and they will sell off a couple pieces that prove to be very valuable, and they will get some more help coming into a farm system that is already much improved after last year's sale. Now, one of the reasons why the Mets haven't been as good as they were supposed to be this year is their defense. I want to close the show just going through the numbers on that really quick. So we'll get to that in just a minute. First, though, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You got the Boston Celtics now in the NBA Finals, and you have another team on the verge of a sweep with the Dallas Mavericks. Will the Minnesota Timberwolves push back and push the series to a fifth game? If you want to bet on that, $5 on either team. You win that, you're going to $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. When you play on FanDuel, you can bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. When you're watching a Mets game, you can do a same-game parlay. So if you love the starting pitcher on the mound and you want to take the over on strikeouts, so today if it's Tyler or McGill, you want to take the over there. Maybe you like Jeff McNeil, you think he's hot right now to take the over on hits? You can do that. Combine it with the Mets win, and you can win big. All of that is available for you at FanDuel. If you win that first $5 bet, again, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed that you can play with. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I just mentioned the Boston Celtics heading to the NBA Finals. If you want to stay up to date on everything going on in the NBA playoffs and the NHL playoffs, make sure you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. Now, Gary Cohen the other day on the broadcast mentioned that the Mets had the worst defense in baseball based on defensive run saved. Now, they were sitting at the time, I believe, over -30 defensive runs saved. Maybe when Harrison Bader robs a home run, other plays are made, Brett Beatty, whatever it was from that last game, they have actually gone to -28 defensive runs saved. They are the second worst defensive team in baseball, behind only the Chicago White Sox, who are at -32. But is defensive runs saved the metric that you should turn to when it comes to defensive stats? Personally, I like outs above average more for a couple of reasons, particularly with team defense. For one, there is no outs above average for catchers and pitchers. And that's a big thing because look at how the Mets get to -28 defensive runs saved. 8 of them are Omar Narvaez. 8 of them. Beyond that, you have Jake Diekman and Jose Quintana -1 apiece. Jorge Lopez -2. Edwin Diaz -3 defensive runs saved. What has he been doing? And it kind of goes from there. I think Tomas Nido also -1. Now, you could definitely say that the Mets catching situation has been one of the reasons they have been so bad defensively, maybe the worst reason. But when it comes to just the overall collective defense of a team, that's not really what jumps out to me because I'd rather evaluate the catchers based on the defensive stats you can find at Baseball Savant between pitch framing, blocking, and controlling the running game. It's just more detailed. So I don't like to lump their defensive stats into the team's defense. So that's one. 2, I just think outs above average is a better stat. If you look at defensive runs saved and outs above average, I think the biggest difference is outs above average. So let me just read the definitions for you first. Okay. Defensive runs saved is a measure of the entire defensive performance by attempting to measure how many runs a defender saved. It takes into account errors, range, outfield arm, and double play ability. It differs only slightly from ultimate zone rating in its formula, but the concept is the same. Now, outs above average, you look at that for baseball. What does that mean? The difference is a higher value placed on not only the range, but also the difficulty of plays. That's the difference, okay? So it's a range-based metric of skill that shows how many outs a player has saved. So instead of runs, it's quantifying by outs. And it takes into account the probability of a play being made. So for outfielders, there's catch probability. And it will factor and it will debit and credit guys based on, all right, that catch that Harrison Bader made robbing that home run only had a 10% probability of being caught. So by catching it, he's credited 0.9 when it comes to his outs above average. Or Starling Marte should have got to that ball that he took 2 steps forward in, and then it went over his head. And that had a probability of 80%. He should have caught it. So that's going to minus him 0.8. I just think that the scale, it makes more sense. And when I look eye test compared to metric, outs above average usually is a more accurate reading to me. With that said, you go through the defensive run save stats for the everyday player. Starling Marte, -5. Jeff McNeil and Pete Alonso, -4. Brandon Nimmo, -3 in left field and -2 in center field. Tyrone Taylor, -2 in left. And then you have McNeil in left, -1. DJ Stewart, -1 in both left and -1 in right. Mark Vientos, -1 at third base. So, and also Francisco Lindor, -1. Another one. Now, the positive defensive run save guys. Harrison Bader, +4. Tyrone Taylor, +2. And then you have Adrian Hauser, Luis Severino, and Jose Budo at 1 apiece. Francisco Alvarez at 1. Outs above average. The Mets have Francisco Lindor with +6 outs above average. Harrison Bader with +5 outs above average. Despite some of the miscues, I still watch Francisco Lindor play shortstop. I think he's great. I do. So I like that metric a little bit more. That's favoring him better. Brett Beatty at 0 defensive run save, +2 outs above average. I've watched all year. To me, he is adding value to the Mets. Brandon Nimmo, 1 out above average. I don't feel like he's hurt the Mets this year defensively. Tyrone Taylor is -1 in left and right, 0 in center. DJ Stewart -1 at first base and in left. Here's where the Mets have some guys that are hurting them based on outs above average that line up with defensive runs saved. When the two stats agree, that's when you know that it's a pretty definite when it comes to a real opinion we can form from the stats. So Jeff McNeil, -3 outs above average. Pete Alonso, -4. Starling Marte, -6. If you look at where the Mets had defensive woes this year, it starts with those three guys. Jeff McNeil has not been good at second. Pete Alonso has not been great at first. And Starling Marte has been really bad in right. Those are the guys, and it's all on that same side of the field, that are hurting you. And then there's the catcher situation. And also, whenever you stick DJ Stewart out there, you sort of understand you're taking a step back defensively. And same thing can be said for Mark Vientos, but you need their bats in the lineup at times. Ultimately, a way to get around the defensive woes is putting the stellar defenders on the field as much as possible. So to me, that means Harrison Bader should be in this lineup as much as possible because Tyrone Taylor is not giving you enough defensively. And I don't think there is a gap between the two of them offensively. And honestly, Bader has certainly been swinging a lot better. So I think Harrison Bader has earned an everyday role in this team. And Tyrone Taylor should be a guy that's a defensive sub, a pinch runner, just playing a smaller role off the bench. Beyond that, how the Mets get better defensively, Jeff McNeil is a better defender than this. I truly believe that. So I think he can up his game. As much as Pete Alonso is hated by the metrics, when I watch him most of the time, it doesn't jump out. He's good around the bag when it comes to making the picks, catching the high throw, all those different things. He's good diving to his right. And so I don't look at him as a huge detriment defensively, but it sort of is what it is there. And Starling Marte, right, it's another issue where you sort of have to live with it for now. But honestly, if that ended up being a byproduct as we complete this show coming full circle on the deadline, if the result of this year's sell-off is the Mets find a taker for Marte, even if they're eating 90% of that contract, as much as he was a huge piece of the 2022 Mets, that contract between what happened last year, how he looks this year, what he does to you defensively, and the fact that you have some really good prospects coming in Drew Gilbert, Jet Williams, Luis Angel Acuna, that all could play the outfield conceivably, or you could always play one of them at second base, move Jeff McNeil to right, where I think he actually plays a really good right field. Getting Marte out of your 2025 plans, I believe would be a really nice thing because I think he's just at the point in his career where he's hurting you in a lot of ways that, you don't always see, but defensively in particular. And we'll see how he hits down the stretch here before you get to the deadline. If he hits really well, you might be able to actually get something too if you eat the contract. Anyway, when it comes to what this team was supposed to be, the defense was supposed to help their pitching staff, and it just hasn't. I don't think it's as overblown, or I think it is overblown. I don't think it's as bad as it's made out to be when you say they're the worst team in baseball based on defensive run save. If you look at the other metrics, you have Fangraphs DEF, which is their defensive metric. The Mets are ranked 21st among all teams there. Outs above average, they're ranked 21st. Ultimate zone rating, they are at 24th. And fielding run value, they're at 22nd. So you look at, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4 different defensive metrics that are all in agreement that the Mets are not the worst, but definitely, bottom barrel. They're in the 20 to 25 or 20 to 21 to 24 range when it comes to worst defensive teams, compared to one stat defensive run save that has them as the worst. And 8 of those defensive run saves come from Omar Narvaez. I think you can't just look at defensive run save and say this is the worst defensive team in baseball. It's a team that isn't as good as they should be and is definitely not performing well on that side, but not as atrocious as it was made out to be. Anyway, longer show today. I appreciate all of you who have tuned in this whole time. I will be back tomorrow breaking down a doubleheader between the Mets and the Dodgers. Looking forward to that. If you're listening on the audio side, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, making a push to 9,000 subs. So I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. You can follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. And after a second watch today, head over to Locked On Sports Today to be up to date on all the latest in the world of sports.